At noon on August 15, 1945, Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki sat in his quarters at the 5th Air Fleet headquarters in Koya, Kyushu, listening to Emperor Hirohito announce Japan's surrender over the radio. The war was over. Japan had lost. Ugaki opened his diary, the Sensuru, and began writing his final entry. He had kept this diary since October 1941, recording nearly every day of the Pacific War from his position first as Chief of Staff of the Combined Fleet under Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto and later as Commander of Battleship Divisions and Air Fleets. The diary filled 731 pages. It contained operational details, strategic assessments, personal reflections. But this final entry would be different. This would be his last words as a serving officer of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Ugaki wrote that he had not yet received an official ceasefire order. He wrote that he alone was to blame for the failure of Japanese aviators to stop the American advance. He wrote that he would fly one last mission himself to show the true spirit of Bushido. What Ugaki didn't write in that final entry, but what filled the pages of his diary over the previous 4 years was a slow, methodical realization that had been building since the Battle of Midway. A realization that Japan could not win this war. Not because Japanese sailors weren't brave enough, not because Japanese tactics weren't sound, but because American industry made victory mathematically impossible. The numbers told a story that no amount of courage could overcome. The first time Ugaki truly understood what Japan was facing came on June 8, 1942, 3 days after the Battle of Midway. Midway had been catastrophic. For Japanese fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu had been sunk in a single day. All 4 had participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. The carriers had been lost along with 248 carrier aircraft and over 3,000 men, including many of Japan's most experienced pilots. Ugaki had been Chief of Staff of the Combined Fleet under Admiral Yamamoto. He had helped plan the Midway operation. The strategy was sound. Lure the American carriers into a decisive battle. Destroy them. Secure Japanese control of the Central Pacific. But something had gone wrong. The Americans had known they were coming. Their dive bombers had caught the Japanese carriers at the worst possible moment, with aircraft being refueled and rearmed on the hangar decks. The bombs had turned those carriers into infernos. On June 8, Ugaki wrote in his diary, quote, "Thus the distressing day of June 5 came to an end. Don't let another day like this come to us during the course of this war. Let this day be the only one of the greatest failure of my life." End quote. He believed at the time that Midway was a temporary setback. Japan still had powerful surface forces. The carriers could be replaced. New pilots could be trained. The war could still be won. But then the intelligence reports started coming in. By late June 1942, Japanese naval intelligence had compiled preliminary assessments of American industrial capacity. The numbers seemed impossible. Propaganda surely. American exaggeration designed to intimidate. The report said American shipyards were building escort carriers at a rate of 1 every 3 weeks. Fleet carriers were under construction at yards from Virginia to California. Cruisers, destroyers, submarines. The production numbers kept climbing. Ugaki read these reports with growing unease. If the numbers were even remotely accurate, Japan's strategic position was far more precarious than anyone in the Naval Ministry wanted to admit. The second carrier Ugaki watched die was the Taiho in June 1944 during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. By then, Ugaki had recovered from injuries sustained when American fighters shot down his aircraft over Bougainville in April 1943. That attack had killed Admiral Yamamoto. Ugaki had been in a separate bomber behind Yamamoto's plane. He watched it spiral into the jungle. He survived the crash of his own aircraft into the sea. One of only 3 survivors. After months of recovery, Ugaki took command of the 1st Battleship Division. In February 1944, he flew his flag from the battleship Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, 72,000 tons fully loaded, 18.1 in guns, the pride of the Imperial Navy. But by 1944, Ugaki understood that battleships no longer determined naval supremacy. Carriers did, and Japan was losing carriers faster than they could be replaced. The Taiho had been Japan's newest fleet carrier, 34,000 tons, armored flight deck, state-of-the-art damage control. Completed in March 1944 after 3 years of construction. She represented the pinnacle of Japanese carrier design. She lasted 3 months. On June 19, 1944, during what the Americans would call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, the Tahoe was hit by a single torpedo from the American submarine Albacore. One torpedo. The damage seemed manageable at first, but aviation fuel vapor spread through the ship's ventilation system. At approximately 1,430 hours, the Taiho exploded from a massive internal blast. She sank, taking most of her crew with her. That same day, the carrier Shikaku was sunk by the submarine Kavala. 2 more carriers, Hayo and the light carrier Cheetos, were lost later in the battle. Japan had entered the Battle of the Philippine Sea with 9 carriers. 3 were sunk. They left with 6. The Americans had entered with 15 carriers. They left with 15 carriers. Not one had been sunk. Ugaki wrote in his diary that night. He noted the loss of hundreds of aircraft. He noted the deaths of experienced pilots who could not be replaced. He noted that the American fleet seemed larger every time they encountered it. He didn't need to write what everyone in the combined fleet already knew. They were being overwhelmed. The worst part wasn't the battles Japan was losing. The worst part was watching the American fleet grow larger between battles. In July 1942, 1 month after Midway, the Americans had commissioned the USS Essex, the first of a new class of fleet carriers, 27,000 tons, 90 aircraft. The Essex had been laid down in April 1941 before Pearl Harbor. She was completed in just 20 months. By December 1942, 6 Essex-class carriers were under construction. By the end of 1943, 5 had been completed and commissioned. By the end of 1944, 17 Essex-class carriers were in service. Japan built 6 aircraft carriers in the 3 years after Midway. 6. The United States built 17 Essex-class fleet carriers alone. That didn't count the escort carriers. Small, cheap, built on merchant ship hulls. The Americans were churning them out like automobiles. The Casablanca-class escort carriers were being built at a rate that seemed physically impossible. Each ship took an average of 3 months from Kong to commissioning. 3 months for a carrier. 50 Casablanca-class escort carriers were completed between November 1942 and July 1944. 50 carriers in less than 2 years. Ugaki read the intelligence reports listing American carrier movements. Every month there were more carriers, more escorts, more destroyers, more cruisers. The American fleet wasn't just replacing losses. It was growing exponentially, while Japan's fleet shrank with every engagement. By early 1944, Japanese intelligence estimated that American shipyards had launched more tonnage in the past 2 years than Japan had launched in the previous 20 years. The numbers seemed like fantasy, but capture documents confirmed them. Liberty ships were being completed every 42 days on average. One had been built in a record 4 days and 15 hours as a publicity stunt. Destroyers that would have taken 2 years to build in Japanese yards were being launched in 10 months by American yards working around the clock. The Americans were building ships faster than anyone could sink them. Japan had lost Midway because 4 carriers were sunk. If the Americans lost 4 carriers, they barely noticed. They had dozens more and more launching every month. On October 24, 1944, Ugaki commanded the 1st Battleship Division during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. This was supposed to be Japan's decisive victory. The plan was complex. Multiple forces would converge on Leyte Gulf, where American forces were supporting the invasion of the Philippines. Admiral Kurita's center force, including the Yamato and her sister ship, Musashi, would sail through San Bernardino Strait and attack the American landing forces. Oki was aboard the Yamato as part of Kurita's force. The battle became a disaster. On October 24th, the Musashi was attacked by waves of American carrier aircraft. The Americans sent dive bombers and torpedo bombers and coordinated strikes. The Musashi was hit by 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs. The damage overwhelmed even her massive armor and compartmentalization. She capsized and sank that afternoon. Ugaki watched from the Yamato as the Musashi, the largest battleship in the world, identical to Yamato in every way, disappeared beneath the waves. If Musashi could be sunk by carrier aircraft, then Yamato could be sunk. Then any ship could be sunk. The American carriers off Leyte launched strike after strike. They seemed to have unlimited aircraft. Their pilots were well-trained, coordinated, aggressive. Japanese air cover was minimal. Most of Japan's carrier aircraft had been destroyed during the Battle of the Philippine Sea 4 months earlier. The Battle of Leyte Gulf ended with Japan losing 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. It was the largest naval battle in history. Japan's surface fleet had been effectively destroyed as a fighting force. The Americans had lost 1 light carrier, 2 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, and 1 destroyer escort. After Leyte Gulf, the war was effectively over for the Imperial Navy. There were no carriers left, no experienced pilots. Fuel was scarce. Most remaining ships were trapped in home waters with no oil to operate. But the Americans kept coming. More carriers, more battleships, more aircraft. Their fleet was so large now that they could bombard Japanese cities with impunity. Battleships would sail close to shore and fire their guns at factories and military installations. Japan couldn't stop them. In February 1945, Ugaki was appointed commander of the 5th Air Fleet based in Kyushu. His command consisted primarily of land-based aircraft, many of them designated for kamikaze attacks. The kamikaze had become Japan's primary weapon, not because it was effective, but because it was all they had left. Young pilots with minimal training would load their aircraft with explosives and crash into American ships. UKI organized the Operation Kikusui attacks, waves of kamikaze aircraft sent against the American fleet off Okinawa. The attacks caused casualties and damaged ships, but they didn't stop the American advance. During April and May 1945, hundreds of kamikaze aircraft attacked American ships near Okinawa. They sank no capital ships. They damaged many vessels, but no cruisers or battleships or fleet carriers were permanently disabled. The Americans simply had too many ships. Even successful kamikaze attacks barely dented American combat power. Ugaki noted in his diary the shrinking numbers of available aircraft, the declining quality of pilots, the mechanical problems caused by fuel shortages and lack of spare parts. Japan was running out of everything except the will to keep fighting. On April 7, 1945, the Yamato made her final sortie. She was sent on a one-way mission to Okinawa with barely enough fuel for a one-way trip. The plan was to beat her and use her as an immobile gun platform. She never reached Okinawa. American submarines detected her departure. Carrier aircraft were scrambled. Hundreds of aircraft from multiple carriers swarmed the Yamato. She was hit by at least 11 torpedoes and 6 bombs. At 1,423 hours, a massive explosion tore the ship apart and she sank. Over 3,000 men died. Ugaki had served on the Yamato for months. He knew many of the officers who died with her. The Yamato had been the symbol of Japanese naval power, unsinkable, invincible. The Americans had destroyed her in less than 2 hours. By July 1945, Ugaki's entries in his diary had become increasingly pessimistic. He wrote about the bombing of Japanese cities, the destruction of industry, the starvation of civilians, the complete collapse of organized defense. He wrote about the atomic bomb that destroyed Hiroshima on August 6. 3 days later, another destroyed Nagasaki. Ugaki noted that entire cities were being erased, that no defense existed against such weapons. The Soviet Union declared war on August 8 and invaded Manchuria. Japanese forces there collapsed within days. Ugaki understood what many in the Japanese government refused to accept. The war was lost. It had been lost for years. Possibly it had been lost the day it started when Japan attacked a nation with 10 times its industrial capacity. On the morning of August 15, 1945, after listening to the Emperor's surrender broadcast, Ugaki made his decision. He would not surrender. He would fly one last kamikaze mission against the American fleet off Okinawa. He would die as a warrior, showing other officers the spirit that Japan needed in defeat. His subordinates tried to talk him out of it. Vice Admiral Jishima Takagi, a close friend, argued with him for an hour. The war was over. Further deaths were pointless. Ugaki refused. Prior to boarding his aircraft, Ugaki posed for photographs. He removed his rank insignia from his dark green uniform. He took only a ceremonial short sword that Admiral Yamamoto had given him before Yamamoto's death in 1943. Ugaki climbed into the back seat of a Yokosuka D-4Y-4 dive bomber. Allied reporting named Judy, piloted by Lieutenant Tatsuo Nakatu. Warrant Officer Akoshi Endo, whose place Ugaki had taken, climbed into the same cramped space. The aircraft took off with 3 men aboard instead of the normal 2. 10 other aircraft accompanied Ugaki on what would be called the last kamikaze mission of World War II. Warrant Officer Endo served as radioman during the flight. 1924 hours, he sent Ugaki's final message. The admiral reported that the aircraft had begun its dive onto an American vessel. No American records indicate any successful kamikaze attack that day. The war was over. American ships were on alert, but not expecting attacks. It's likely that Ugaki's aircraft and most the others were shot down by anti-aircraft fire or crashed into the ocean. 3 aircraft returned to base due to engine problems. They were the only survivors of the mission. Ugaki's body was never recovered. His final diary entry written that morning before the flight ended abruptly. There was no conclusion, no summary, just the decision to die. What Japanese analysts discovered after the war shocked even those who had read Ugaki's diary. American industrial production during World War II dwarfed anything Japan could have achieved. The numbers were so extreme they seemed impossible. From 1941 to 1945, American shipyards built approximately 9,000 war vessels, not including landing craft. Japan built approximately 670. The United States built 151 aircraft carriers of all types. Japan built 25. American yards launched Liberty ships at an average rate of 3 ships every 2 days for 3 years. 2,710 Liberty ships were completed. Each carried 10,000 tons of cargo. Together, they could transport more cargo than the entire Japanese merchant fleet. At the start of the war, American factories produced 297,000 aircraft during the war. Japan produced 76,000. In 4 years, American industrial production doubled. By 1944, the United States was producing more military equipment than Germany, Japan, and Italy combined. The comparison became more stark when examining specific time periods. In 1944 alone, American shipyards launched more tonnage than Japan had launched from 1939 to 1945. 1 year of American production exceeded 6 years of Japanese production. The Essex-class carriers that Ugaki watched multiply throughout the war had originally been estimated to take 36 months to build when ordered in 1940. By wartime production standards, they were being completed in 18 to 20 months. The fastest was built in 14 months. 5 Essex-class carriers were laid down. By the time of Pearl Harbor, 17 were completed by the end of the war. 14 saw combat. All 14 survived. The manufacturing efficiency wasn't limited to ships. The Boeing B-7 bomber had an average production time of 200 days at Boeing plants in Seattle, but Douglas and Lockheed built them in half that time. Consolidated built B-24 bombers in as little as 44 days. Grumman reduced production time for F-6F Hellcat fighters from 90 days to 65 days through assembly line improvements and worker training. Ford's Willower Run plant in Michigan produced B-24 Liberator bombers at a rate of 1 aircraft every 63 minutes during peak production. The statistics extended to everything: artillery pieces, trucks, tanks, ammunition. By 1944, American factories were producing so much material that shortages were almost unknown. If a ship needed repair, spare parts were available. If an aircraft was damaged, replacement parts arrived within days. If a unit needed ammunition, supply ships delivered it by the ton. Japan's situation was the opposite. Every loss was permanent. Every damaged ship remained damaged for months waiting for repair. Every destroyed aircraft meant 1 less aircraft in the fleet. Spare parts were scarce. Ammunition was rationed. Fuel was critically short. By 1945, Japanese industry was effectively destroyed. American B-29 Superfortress bombers had systematically destroyed factory after factory. The firebombing of Tokyo on March 9 and 10, 1945 alone killed over 100,000 people and destroyed 16 square miles of the city, including countless small factories and workshops. Without factories, Japan couldn't build ships. Without ships, Japan couldn't import resources. Without resources, what few factories remained couldn't operate. The entire economy had collapsed into a death spiral. The naval officers who read Ugaki's diary after his death found passage after passage documenting his growing awareness of these realities. Early in the war, he had been optimistic. After Midway, concerned. By 1943, pessimistic. By 1944, resigned to defeat. One entry from October 1944, written shortly after the Battle of Leyte Gulf, noted that American ship movements indicated the presence of at least 30 carriers in the Pacific theater. Ugaki wrote that Japan had no carriers capable of offensive operations. The imbalance was so extreme that engagement was suicide. Another entry from March 1945 described watching American battleships bombarded the coast of Kyushu from offshore. Ugi noted that Japan had no ability to stop them. The ships fired their guns at Japanese positions, then sailed away undamaged. This had once been unthinkable. Now it was routine. In April 1945, Ugaki wrote about the invasion of Okinawa. American forces had landed with overwhelming strength. 760 ships supported the operation. 1,500 aircraft provided air cover. Against this, Japan could send only kamikaze attacks that accomplished little. The final entries before August 15 focused on the atomic bombs and Soviet invasion. Ugi noted that Japan had no defense against atomic weapons and no reserves to stop the Soviet advance in Manchuria. He noted that the Americans seemed capable of producing an unlimited number of these new bombs. Intelligence suggested they had more ready. He was correct. The Americans had prepared a third atomic bomb for use in late August if Japan hadn't surrendered. The tragedy of Ugaki's diary is that everything he feared was true. American industrial capacity had made Japanese victory impossible from the moment the war began. Admiral Yamato, who Ugaki had served under and who Ugaki considered a mentor, had understood this before Pearl Harbor. Yamato had studied in America at Harvard. He had traveled across the United States in the 1920s. He had seen American factories, shipyards, oil fields. He knew what Japan would face. Yamato had opposed war with the United States. He had argued against the tripartite pact with Germany and Italy. He had received death threats from Japanese nationalists for his opposition to war. When the decision for war was made, despite his warnings, Yamato told his staff, "I can run wild for 6 months or a year, but after that, I have utterly no confidence." He was remarkably accurate. Pearl Harbor was December 7, 1941. The Battle of Midway was June 4, 1942. Exactly 6 months after Midway, Japan never again won a major naval engagement. The intelligence analysts who examined the war after its conclusion determined that Japan's defeat became inevitable the moment American industrial production reached full wartime capacity. That occurred in mid-1943. From that point forward, American production so overwhelmed Japanese production that no tactical brilliance or strategic innovation could compensate for the numerical disparity. The analysts calculated that even if Japan had won every major battle from Midway onward, if every engagement had resulted in equal losses for both sides, the Americans would still have won the war through simple attrition. They were building ships and aircraft faster than Japan could destroy them, even in victory. By late 1944, American shipyards were actually slowing production because there were more ships than needed. Additional Essex-class carriers were delayed or canceled, not because of shortages or problems, but because the existing fleet was more than sufficient to defeat Japan. Japan couldn't slow production. Japan had to fight with what already existed because new production was impossible. Some military historians argue that the Pacific War was decided by the Battle of Midway. Others point to Guadalcanal or the Philippine Sea or Leyte Gulf as the turning point. The economists and industrial analysts who studied the war reached a different conclusion. The war was decided before it began by the disparity in industrial capacity between the two nations. Japan in 1941 produced approximately 7 million tons of steel per year. The United States produced over 80 million tons. Japan had minimal domestic oil production and depended almost entirely on imports from conquered territories in Southeast Asia. The United States produced 1.4 billion barrels per year domestically and controlled additional sources in Latin America and the Middle East. The disparity in economic power was enormous. American industrial output dwarfed Japanese capacity in every category. Those numbers meant that America could build 10 carriers for every carrier Japan built. America could lose 3 carriers and replace them within 6 months. Japan could lose 1 carrier and never replace it. The mathematics of industrial warfare made victory impossible for Japan. Ugaki understood this. Yamato had understood it. Most of the professional naval officers understood it by 1943, if not earlier. But the war continued for 2 more years because the political leadership refused to accept these realities until atomic weapons and Soviet intervention forced capitulation. After the war, American occupation forces recovered Ugaki's diary from his quarters in Kyushu. The diary was eventually translated and published in 1991 under the title Fading Victory. Historians Donald Goldstein and Catherine Dillon edited the translation with a foreword by Gordon Pring. The publication of the diary provided Western readers with the first comprehensive Japanese account of strategic planning throughout the war written by a major participant. Ugaki had been present for nearly every important Japanese naval decision from Pearl Harbor through August 1945. His diary entries revealed the internal debates, the intelligence assessments, the growing desperation as American strength increased and Japanese strength diminished. The entries showed how Japanese naval commanders watched their forces shrink while American forces grew larger every month. Military historians who studied the diary noted that Ugaki's assessment of American industrial capacity was remarkably accurate. His estimates of American ship production matched actual figures. His concerns about pilot quality and aircraft availability proved prescient. But Ugaki never broke faith with his duty as he understood it. Even after concluding that victory was impossible, he continued organizing attacks, planning operations, sending young pilots to their deaths and kamikaze strikes. His final act was consistent with this pattern. He flew to his death because he believed it was the honorable thing to do, even though he knew it would accomplish nothing. The sword Yamamoto gave him, the one he carried on his final flight, was reportedly recovered years later. The blade was engraved with Yamamoto's name. His body was never formally recovered. The next morning, crew from an American landing ship found wreckage and bodies on a beach, but formal identification was never completed. Ugaki's final resting place remains unknown. The diary itself, the original handwritten volumes, is preserved in Japanese military archives. Researchers can still read Ugaki's actual handwriting, see the dates marked at the top of each entry, follow his thought process as the war progressed. Some entries are mundane, recording weather conditions, ship movements, routine administrative decisions. Others are profound, analyzing strategic situations, assessing Japan's chances, grappling with the moral implications of sending men to certain death. The entry from August 15, 1945, is short, less than 1 page. Ugaki wrote that he had listened to the Emperor's broadcast. He wrote that the war had ended in defeat. He wrote that he accepted full responsibility for this defeat in his capacity as commander of the 5th Air Fleet. He wrote that he would lead one final attack to show that Japanese fighting spirit remained unbroken. Then he closed the diary, placed it on his desk, and walked to the airfield. The diary entries stopped there. No epilogue, no final reflection. Just an abrupt ending as Ugaki climbed into the aircraft that would kill him. That's how wars actually end. Not through official channels or diplomatic ceremonies, but through admirals and generals who see the mathematics of defeat written clearly in production statistics and casualty lists, but continue fighting because their understanding of duty demands it. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. And we'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania. From veterans to history enthusiasts, you're part of something special here. Thank you for watching and thank you for keeping these stories